And what's so nice about it is it doesn't start, it's only a 2-page document, but it doesn't start from the problems with the TUC saying, well, of course, we begrudgingly accept volunteers, but there's, we have to be really guarded against job substitution. This document starts from a ringing endorsement of the value of volunteering in all the ways that I outlined at the beginning about why volunteering is so important and so vital for our communities, that the TUC, alongside Volunteering England, has endorsed and signed up to. And we then go through the checklist of points about avoiding job substitution, ensuring the added value of volunteering in order to make that relationship work. So we need to guard against any of that, all of that, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that I would like to see volunteering just going into our private companies in order to get things done on the tube. That would be the death for volunteering. But I do think we need to take stock. We need to take stock for 2 reasons. One, because we need to look around us and we can see, if we look carefully, that volunteers are already engaged in many ways, creative ways, in for-profit organisations. And it's happening very well, thank you very much indeed. And those volunteers, I would argue, are getting a very good deal out of that experience. And just to give you a couple of examples, I, with a couple of friends in Rutland Water, who live in Rutland Water, a couple of friends of mine, went to a private for-profit garden a few weeks ago. A lovely garden, based around the work of one of our TV gardeners on Gardener's World, and it's now owned by a private family. It's privately run. There's an entrance fee for people to get into it, but there's a very active and thriving volunteer group there that behave like any other volunteer group you would expect to see in a National Trust property, for example. They feel they're getting a very good deal out of it. They're getting access to a beautiful garden. They're getting training and support from professional gardeners there. And in return, they're giving 2 hours of their time a week or whatever to go along and to get involved in that volunteering experience. That's one example. A second example is a friend of mine who volunteers at the local football club that I'm a season ticket holder at as a steward, and he feels that again is a good relationship for him. He gets free access to the games, even if sometimes he has to stand with his back to the game, and in return for what he sees as an absolutely valid volunteering opportunity. People who volunteer, young people, students who volunteer at the Glastonbury Festival can get a ticket for the Glastonbury Festival. It's a private money-making venture, but it's been going on for a long time, and many of those young people and others who volunteer wouldn't see it contravening some huge value base that we hold dear. People who volunteer on Amazon to write book reviews or critiques of grading of DVDs. That's a volunteer activity, but it's for a private firm. So there's lots, and I could go on and on and on, but there's lots of ways in which volunteers are already heavily involved in for-profit activities, for-profit institutions. If we are to say, line in the sand, we're not going to accept this at all, then we have to have a good reason for telling those people they can't volunteer in those settings, that somehow it's contravening our values. The second reason why I think we need to look again at this issue, the more pressing issue in many ways, is because of the way in which service delivery is changing in our society. Particularly, and the example I want to use is residential care services for older people. It's already about 70% of residential care services are privately run for older people in our community, and that percentage is going to go up even further over the coming years. Now, if we're to say that volunteers can't be placed in for-profit residential care homes, what we're saying, and we would have had to say it to my father-in-law, who bravely fought Parkinson's disease, first of all in a voluntary sector, an NHS care home, fantastic volunteering programme, I couldn't talk about more highly enough. He had absolute brilliant sort of support and friendship from volunteers who came in. Interestingly, the head volunteer was a guy, which I always find funny, was a guy called Tony Blair. It wasn't Tony Blair, it was another Tony Blair. He came in every day after work to provide comfort to people and support and have a beer and watch the football with people like my father-in-law. He then went to an equally good in terms of the standard of care in the private sector, but there was no volunteer programme at all. And I talked to the warden, the matron who was running that, and said, well, wouldn't it be great to have some friends who could come in and talk to people like my father-in-law? And she said, oh no, well, we've tried it, but we get a very blank response when we talk to people about it, because it seemed to be really not appropriate for us to be developing a volunteering programme. Well, I would ask why. paid professional staff. Of course they shouldn't go in there to clean the floors or the toilets or to provide the food. But are we really saying that we shouldn't have friends and supporters and befrienders going into a private residential care home just because it's transferred from the voluntary sector or the statutory sector? I think that's a very difficult person. I think that's a very difficult argument to uphold. So that's, I'm sure, going to be a nice lively debate at our AGM. But both of those examples were examples where I think as a movement we need to be prepared to challenge some of our long-held values without compromising, I would argue, and on our values and simply riding roughshod over everything that makes our movement special. But I think we need to look again at some of those issues if we're going to really open up volunteering, make it more attractive, make it more relevant for the 21st century. And that's the second part of my vision. The third part relates to the issue of funding. All of what I've said, all about unleashing the power of volunteering, will only happen if there is sufficient investment in volunteering to make it happen. And I do worry that at a time when we know whoever gets into power at the next general election, public funding settlement is going to be increasingly tight. I do worry that we're going to, if we're not careful and if we're not vigilant, fall back into that very sterile and misguided argument that volunteering is free from cost. Great, you can just see it, great politicians will say at a time of economic austerity, we can bring all these volunteers in to unleash all of that power, all of that dynamism that I talked about at the beginning. But it won't happen unless there's an investment up front. Volunteering doesn't just happen. It needs organising, it needs supporting, we need to have properly trained volunteer managers, we need to have a properly funded local infrastructure, a network of volunteer centres that not only broker people into volunteering, but help to provide the climate at the local and regional level where volunteering can flourish. Volunteering is very good value for money. That's the case we can go back with. There's some research that we've carried out at Volunteering England that suggests for every £1 that an organisation or a local government invests in volunteering, you get an economic return of about £7 or £8. So it's fantastically good value for money when people are thinking about economic issues, but you need to invest that £1 up front to unleash that economic value. And that's going to, I think, we haven't won that argument anyway yet, but it's going to become an increasingly important argument to make sure we don't lose over the coming few years. And that's the third part of my vision, for a vision that recognises that for the value of volunteering to be truly realised, governments, funders need to invest in volunteering. They need to put that resource in order to get the reward out. Very briefly, because I don't want to go on too much longer, we're much better to have some questions and conversation and discussion. So I'll skirt over very quickly. In fact, I'll bring them together, my fourth and fifth vision, which is around something I talked about at the very beginning. It's about, and it comes back also to this notion of holding on to our values, about what makes us different. Volunteering isn't about just unpaid work. It's about something different. It's got its own spirit, its own dynamic, its own motivation as to why people get involved in volunteering. And I fear that some of the moves to professionalise it run the risk of seeing it simply as a form of unpaid work, which I think would be really detrimental to the power of our movement. And it's paradoxical in a sense, certainly coming from me as Chief Executive of Volunteering England, which is an organisation that for the last 5 years, and before that the various constituent parts that went into making Volunteering England, have been campaigning long and loud to say, volunteering needs to be taken more seriously. We need to invest in it. We need to train volunteers and volunteer managers. We need to accredit. We need to support. We need to recognise. And of course, I'm not saying we don't need to do any of that. We need to do more of that. But we need to do it with a mind on what makes volunteering different, and not to run the risk of simply treating volunteering as a form of unpaid work and over-formalising it, over-systemising it. Because if we do, then I think we'll really miss a trick, and that I think will not prove to be particularly a good clarion call. Come and volunteer, it's paid work without the pay. Doesn't seem to me to be a particularly attractive call for people to volunteer. Come and volunteer because it's a dynamic, interactive relationship where you get something out of it, you can put something in, you can help change your community. It's something which is much more powerful. And so let's just be careful as a movement, whilst taking volunteering incredibly seriously, investing in it properly, that we also recognise that there's something very special and distinctive about it.